hear me okay? Loud enough? Hello? Check 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
from someone who has spent a career of 50 years studying the Chinese People's Liberation Army. I got to think about this for a while. I'm not sure what it is. Not entirely joking. So, Chinese strategic culture, Chinese approaches to war are actually very hard to pin down because there are things you can point to, and I'll be pointing to some, but a lot of them, well, they're not unique to China. We see them all over the world in many different cultures, in many different times and places. And then if we're pointing to a Chinese characteristic, we want to say, well, that's really Chinese. We don't want to see it just in the 20th century, right, or the 21st century. We want to see it 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. So, and also, we don't just want to see things in books. We also want some evidence that what they say, what they write, is what they actually do. So it means not just looking at military writings and texts like Sun Tzu's Art of War, but also looking at the record of Chinese military history, what actually happened on the ground. Now I'm going to see if I can successfully advance the slide. First big test here. Yes, okay. So, one way to answer the question of what is the Chinese way of war, what is the Chinese approach to warfare, is just to kind of start with this book. Right? Sun Tzu's Art of War, right? World famous now. It's first appeared around 300 BC in China. It was much esteemed in Chinese culture thereafter. Certainly during the Tang Dynasty, during the 700s AD, a very influential Chinese scholar official wrote an encyclopedia that included a section on warfare. And he organized all the military material around Sun Tzu's Art of War. So each section was a quotation from Sun Tzu's Art of War, and then he would file his material under those quotations. If we move forward on into the 20th century, of course, Mao Zedong, Chairman Mao, the founder of Communist China, leader of the Chinese Revolution, really quoted Sun Tzu's Art of War a number of times in his writing, and indicated a high level of esteem for that ancient work. So, it's certainly possible to suggest, well, why not just turn to Sun Tzu's Art of War to learn everything we need to know about Chinese approaches to warfare? Well, it's a fairly short book, reasonably approachable. It's been esteemed in China for thousands of years. And it's also available in numerous English translations. It was first translated into English very early in the 20th century, and since then it's been translated again and again. So just a moment ago I showed you the cover of the Ralph Sawyer translation. Here we have General Samuel Griffith's translation and the John Minford translation over there. And before I came down here, I tried to count up all the different English translations of it I have in my office. And I reached 10. But I stopped short of digging around in dusty boxes under my desk. So I might have found a couple more if I had done that. So what's wrong, though, with Sun Tzu's Art of War? But why shouldn't we just stop there? First, not all Chinese, including powerful and influential Chinese voices, the voices of political and military leaders, not all of them had a high regard for Sun Tzu's Art of War. Here we see the Emperor Kangxi, who was the second emperor of the Qing dynasty, China's last imperial dynasty. He was on the throne from 1662 until 1722. And he was one of the most successful military leaders in Chinese history. You know, he crushed a huge rebellion in southern China. He led repeated successful campaigns against the Mongols. He was one of the great empire builders in Chinese history. And in one of his writings, he says that I think that the teachings of the ancient military books, including Sun Tzu's Art of War, are nonsense. They're worthless. And I would not employ a general who studies those books. The way to learn how to conduct military operations is through experience, not through books. So this kind of very successful leader had no use for that book. Another problem is that a lot of the contents of Sun Tzu's Art of War is ambiguous, or it's susceptible to multiple interpretations. It's not clear what the author or authors are really arguing. And I'm providing here a fairly simple example. There is a passage in chapter 3. And the Chinese characters are up there, just in case two of you read Chinese. But it's Bei Zi Fen Zhi, and different translators handle this differently. But John Minford does with two split in half. And the way I would do it, just looking at it myself, my rough translation is, if double, then divide them. And the problem here is basically a pronoun. It's not clear what it refers to. The jur here, that is the he, she, it, them, whatever. And it's not clear what that refers to. Does it refer to the enemy army, or does it refer to your own army? And there is a huge Chinese commentarial tradition on Sun Tzu's Art of War. Over the centuries, scholars wrote about it and tried to elucidate these passages. And they disagreed. They disagreed over this. And some of them say it means divide the enemy's army. Some of them say it means divide your own army. You outnumber the enemy 2 to 1. And some try to square the circle by saying you divide your own army in order to divide the enemy's army. So we can't be 100% sure of what this really means. Then there's also the problem that there are plenty of passages in the Art of War that sound really nice. Like it's kind of a more noble, more refined, more gentle approach to warfare. And this is one of the things that has made Sun Tzu's Art of War so attractive to international audiences. The classic example here also comes from chapter 3. So in war, better take a state intact than destroy it. Better take an army, a regiment, a detachment, a company intact than destroy them. this notion that the best victory is the one that's bloodless. It's with no losses or minimal loss, either side. But Chinese military history offers an awful lot of examples that contradict it. That's the record of warfare in China is full of bloody battles, and battles in which really gratuitous damage was done to the losing side by the winners. The classic example of this is the Battle of Chongping. It was fought in 260 BC between the states of Qin and Zhao. Qin was very rising power in Western China. Zhao was somewhat weaker to the east and on the defensive. At Chongping, the two armies faced off for months in both of them occupied systems of field fortifications. And fought numerous kind of small battles and skirmishes kind of in the no man's land between their fortifications. And eventually, the Qin army succeeded in luring the Zhao troops out of their fortifications, surrounding them, cutting them off, and then forced them to surrender. And then, again, according to the kind of best historical account we have of this, which may not be 100% reliable, so a word of caution here, about 50,000 Zhao soldiers were killed in the fighting, and 400,000 were beheaded after they surrendered. That the Qin state had a deliberate policy of bleeding its enemies white, killing POWs, because those POWs, if they went home, would be the soldiers in the next army, and also the farmers who would till the fields to support the state, and also the fathers of the next generation of soldiers. So just bleed the enemy white. The only good POW is a dead POW. So nothing could be a starker contrast with Sun Tzu's Art of War that was probably only written about a century before this. And the pattern too continues. It's not that Chinese warfare is always this frightful, but it can easily go in that direction. Another example comes from much later, from another Qing dynasty emperor, Qianlong, Emperor Qianlong, who's the grandson of Kangxi that we saw before. Qianlong was also a conqueror, and he reigned from 1735 to 1795, and he defeated the Dzungar Mongols, who were the dominant power in Xinjiang, in what's now the far northwest of the People's Republic of China, in the early 18th century. The 1750s, he launched a major military operation against them, defeated them in battle, and then in 1759, his forces effectively exterminated the Dzungars. The operation, again, easily meets modern definitions of genocide. So not a very good fit with Sun Tzu's Art of War. And, okay, what's this guy doing here? Well, okay, another problem with looking to Sun Tzu's Art of War as kind of the text for all of Chinese strategy is that a lot of what is in that book is not unique to China. It's just kind of good advice that plenty of other people around the world, other places, other times, have also understood and practiced. So, for example, Sun Tzu's Art of War tells us that warfare is the way of deception. And some scholars have suggested, yes, and the Chinese are so tricky in warfare, they're always coming up with schemes and stratagems and deceiving the enemy and so forth. But again, that's something that's universal. You can find it in any culture, really in any time. And got one example up here, Napoleon Bonaparte. And my leisure reading this summer is reading about the Napoleonic Wars, and in the campaigns of 1807 in Poland and East Prussia, Napoleon routinely would write a fake orders for one of his marshals, and giving the false positions of his troops. And then he'd hand it to some young officer and send him off on a road where he was sure to be captured by the Russian Cossacks. And so the message would fall into the hands of the Russian commander. And so a deliberate effort, again, to mislead the opponent. And then we find not just French, but even more recently Americans doing much the same thing. I think those of you who've read a lot about World War II are familiar with Operation Fortitude. Right? This was the attempt, and successful attempt, really, in 1944 to convince the Germans that the Allied landing in France would occur in the Pas-de-Calais region to the north, near the Straits of Dover, not in Normandy, farther south. And in fact, the US created an entire bogus force, a dummy force called the First United States Army Group, and assigned General George S. Patton to command it. And it was, again, imaginary. It didn't exist, really, but signal traffic was created and so forth that fooled the Germans. I think that there was this large US force kind of preparing to descend on the Pas-de-Calais, and any moves in the direction of Normandy were the trick. So deception is not especially Chinese, and I would not, that would not be my first kind of go-to as as an example of the unique way that the Chinese practice warfare. Okay, one notion that turns up in Sun Tzu that is, I think, related to the idea of bloodless victory and not doing damage that we saw before is this one. The ultimate excellence lies not in winning every battle, but in defeating the enemy without ever fighting. And then the question, of course, is that how does one actually do that? And if we look at some episodes from Chinese military history, though, we can find kind of examples of how they're able to achieve this. And I think this points us in the direction of practices that are more, say, characteristically Chinese and kind of more supportable on the basis of historical evidence. And so one way of winning without fighting, and one, I think that over the centuries, Chinese generals and rulers have just loved, is awesomeness, or winning through really overawing the enemy, presenting an opponent with such overwhelming force, or the appearance of overwhelming force, that the opponent doesn't even want to fight at all. They just call it quits and say, okay, let's not bother with this. You guys win. You're just too big and powerful. And this was a fairly easy game for China to play through so much of its history because of its huge population, its huge resources, and being surrounded by smaller and weaker neighbors. So you show up with an army of 500,000 men, and the opponent decides that we'd rather not fight. You show up with lots of artillery, and your opponent doesn't have any. We're out of there. The classic example of this is the voyages that the Chinese conducted down to the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s, excuse me, the voyages of the Admiral Zheng He. And there were 7 great voyages, took place roughly between 1400 and 1430. And these were on a massive scale. So there were hundreds of vessels involved, tens of thousands of sailors and Marines on those vessels. The vessels carried artillery, and the largest of them were these treasure ships, like the one depicted here, which is about 400 feet long, but maybe 150 feet wide, 9 masts or so. Is vastly larger than anything else floating on the sea at that time. And here in this image, it's compared to Christopher Columbus's largest ship, the Santa Maria, so against one of Zheng He's treasure ships. And when this flotilla, showed up in ports around the Indian Ocean, around Southeast Asia, almost nobody resisted it. There were really only 2 accounts of serious fighting. Once when they went after some pirates, and once when they carried out a regime change in Sri Lanka. And every place else this fleet went, the locals were just so overawed that they said, okay, we will pay allegiance to the Ming Dynasty, and yes, we will send tribute to Beijing. So, and it's arguable too that some of China's more recent behavior, now that China has recovered a lot of its historical power and strength, it's unified, has a strongly growing economy, centralized authority, and so forth. It is now pursuing the same sort of game. So by building up its navy on a very large scale, the Chinese Navy is now larger than the US Navy in terms of numbers of ships, and to the Navy you can add, of course, the Chinese Coast Guard, Chinese fishery enforcement vessels, most of which are armed, and the maritime militia. So they're putting a lot out onto the water, and they've started to pump out aircraft carriers. I think they're on aircraft carrier number 3 right now. And for those who are kind of familiar with the Ming history, this would seem to come from the same playbook of kind of putting out such a large force that nobody else wants to even mess with China anymore. Okay, another Chinese approach to warfare is one that is, you could say, emphasizes a very slow, very patient approach. That takes a very long view. I'm going to have to, excuse me. Yeah, so another way of winning without fighting is to build up a position of overwhelming strength, but gradually, slowly over time, slowly and surreptitiously, so that it's almost imperceptible to adversaries. And in fact, the opponent doesn't realize that he's been defeated until the game is well, you don't really realize the game is on until it's over. And an example of this we find in the Chinese board game of Wei Qi, which is sometimes described as encirclement chess. I think we know it better as Go, but it differs from chess in that in chess you have pieces that move around and capture each other. And in Go, the pieces are stationary. Once you place a piece, it stays there unless it's captured by being surrounded. And it's a game in which you go for position and try to gradually build up a better position than your opponent has. And some very innocuous moves early in the game can be decisive later on in determining the outcome. And it's really only very good Go players can tell, what those moves are that are going to be kind of the killer moves that are really decisive later. So, Go is very slow, it's protracted, it involves the patient positioning of these pieces, to build up a larger configuration that your opponent eventually can't overcome. For historical examples of this, I can turn first to ancient China, to the Qin dynasty again. The Qin succeeded in conquering the 6 other states of the ancient Chinese world in only 10 years. Just a decade, between 230 and 221 BC. So when the Qin conquest occurred, it was very rapid. The other states collapsed like dominoes. But those states had existed for centuries, as had Qin, that they had been in a sort of a state of equilibrium earlier. But what had happened before 230 BC was that Qin had gradually, slowly accumulated advantages over several hundred years of acquiring pieces of territory at strategic crossroads and choke points so that other states couldn't communicate with each other, of acquiring resources by conquering territory in other directions, by reforming its own legal system and military institutions. So all that kind of very gradual, almost imperceptible gains, and then suddenly in 230 BC, Qin moves. And by 221 BC, it's over. China has its first unified empire. So, and another example really comes from the 20th century, from the Chinese civil wars and also the Japanese invasion of China from 1937 to 1945. So the Chinese communists and nationalists fighting a civil war from the late 1920s through the 1930s. Then the Japanese invade China. The communists and the nationalists get together to resist the Japanese for a while, and then they resume their civil war again in 1945. And that civil war ends in communist victory in 1949. And again, the communist victory after 1945 was extremely fast. The communists were coming from what looked like the weaker position. Right? They had fewer resources than the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek. They controlled less territory. They did not have the backing of the world's strongest military power then, the United States. But they won in only 4 years and surprised much of the world with their victory. But again, they had been building their position patiently, again, for decades before that. They had, during World War II, they had been infiltrating behind Japanese lines and building base areas in communities that the Japanese didn't control or only loosely controlled. So that they were constantly growing the territory and population under their control. And they were also involved in kind of steadily infiltrating the nationalist governing structures and the nationalist military. And so one of the most remarkable features of the Chinese Civil War of 1945 to 1949 is how easily or how thoroughly the communists had the nationalist military establishment infiltrated with spies, informers, and moles. And these included even members of Chiang Kai-shek's staff who were sending secret reports to the communists. So Mao knew what Chiang was going to do almost as soon as Chiang made up his mind. Mao knew it. And it wasn't a two-way street. The nationalists were not able to infiltrate the communists because the communists had a much more disciplined organization, and Mao had pursued a rectification campaign in the early 1940s to really unify thinking within the party, to make everyone totally loyal to him, and to purge anyone who might be suspected of disloyalty. So these are the steady, the kind of slow, gradual steps that the communists took that then made their victory in 1949 really so quick. This patient, kind of slow, steady approach is also related to another pattern. And this is a preference for risk avoidance. And we find this in Sun Tzu's Art of War. Again, and I apologize for a talk that has the title Beyond Sun Tzu. We keep going back to Sun Tzu a lot. But in chapter 4 of Sun Tzu's Art of War, we're told, of old, the skillful warrior first ensured his own invulnerability, and then he waited for the enemy's vulnerability. So you do everything you can to make yourself safe, secure, don't take any risks, and watch carefully and wait for the moment when the other guy makes a mistake and screws up. And then you move, then you take advantage of it. And if you think there's any real possibility of being defeated, then don't start a fight. So you adopt a cautious, calculating approach to conflict. And this comes out too in the first chapter of Sun Tzu's Art of War, really at the very beginning, where there's a discussion of whether or not to go to war at all. And you do sort of a net assessment. Today we'd call it a net assessment of the various strengths of the enemy versus your strengths, their weaknesses versus your weaknesses. And this was done somehow in numerical terms. They assigned numbers to this, and they came up with sort of a final calculation that would determine whether to go to war or not, whether they expected to win or not. So if the numbers are in your favor, you go to war. You make your move. And if the numbers are not in your favor, you don't fight. And this kind of cautious, calculating approach to warfare. And we find it in ancient times, and we find it in the People's Republic of China today, too. That they have, the Chinese have something that they call comprehensive national power. And they have strategists in Beijing calculating this, and every year they recalculate it, and they assign every country in the world a number. And we can kind of guess how they do it, but we don't know exactly how they've never, for obvious reasons, published their secret sauce. But it's, you know, some weighted combination of things like, you know, military forces, the strength of the economy, like GNP, economic growth, things, creativity in science and technology, the strength of the educational system, and the stability of the political system, and they assign numbers to these, and then they weight these numbers, and then they do a final calculation. Okay, here's the number for China, here's the number for Russia, here's the number for the United States, and the numbers change over time. And it seems that the Chinese do base a lot of their behavior on the numbers that they produce through this process. For example, right after the global financial crisis in 2008, China became much more assertive and much less cooperative, and much more uncooperative and demanding. And it seems that the economic crisis caused them to recalculate some of those numbers and move the United States and other Western countries downward while they saw their own numbers going up, and then that was kind of reflected in behavior. So where this leads to is a notion that that if you do the math right, if you gather the right intelligence, if you do the proper calculations, you can predict the outcome. That you know for sure who will win and who will lose. And there's a preference for not acting, you know, until you're sure, or you've convinced yourself you're sure. You don't want to take chances, you don't want to take risks. So. And this is the passage from chapter 1 of Sun Tzu that I mentioned earlier. Victory belongs to the side that scores most in the temple calculations before battle. But this notion that victory can be predicted, success can be predicted with certainty, is, I think, something that sets Chinese thinking about war apart a bit from the way say Western civilization has approached warfare. And just as a counterpoint to the Chinese thinking here, I brought up probably the single most famous Western military thinker of all time, right? The Prussian Karl von Clausewitz, lived from 1780 to 1831 and was active during the Napoleonic Wars. And in his classic study on war, right, Clausewitz kind of repeatedly goes back to the notion that war is really risky. It's inherently full of chance, and kind of you can't be sure of anything. And just to give one quote there from Book 1, Chapter 1, no other human activity is so continuously or universally bound up with chance as war is. And anything in war is more a matter of probability than it is a matter of certainty. So I think this is, an area where I think Chinese thinking about war and strategy and how to approach war is kind of very clearly kind of set apart from thinking elsewhere. I'd say that kind of Clausewitz probably comes closer to the global norm than Sun Tzu does. So I'm not going to go way out on a limb and predict any of China's next moves. But certainly we read a lot lately, news reports about Chinese threats to Taiwan, right, about Chinese warships circling Taiwan, about Chinese aircraft crossing the median line on the Taiwan Strait again and again and again, and kind of hassling Taiwan's air defenses. And then there's always the question, wondering, whether that we were on the brink of a conflict, of an actual, kinetic conflict over Taiwan. And certainly based on what I presented to you this afternoon, it seems to me that what Xi Jinping and his generals are trying to do is actually avoid a kinetic war by just keeping this up for a long time and eventually just scaring their opponents to death, so that Taiwan is too intimidated to resist Beijing's blandishments, and the United States decides that discretion might be the better part of valor in a possible conflict with the People's Republic of China over Taiwan. So I think, again, based on my study of Chinese history, that's where Xi's coming from and what he's trying to accomplish. And suggest too that at the time that China really does something much more radically serious than what it's doing now. And when the missiles start landing on Taiwan or on Okinawa or Guam or someplace else, I think by that time, if that happens, the Chinese will have calculated that they've effectively already won, that the odds have tilted so much in their favor. And the risk with that approach, of course, the danger is that what if Clausewitz is right and not Sun Tzu? That is, it's not a matter of absolute certainty, it's a matter of chance. And if chance is involved in probability, it's possible to miscalculate. And so I think that's really, what I fear the most is actually a Chinese miscalculation. That they're kind of too confident of their own numbers and their own formulae and think they've got it all tied up, and they don't. So I'll leave it at that. I've gone way too far out on a limb already. But I hope there's still time for questions. I wasn't timing myself, and I was told to keep it under 50 minutes.
Plenty of time.
Okay.
So I'll open it up to questions, and I've got a microphone for anyone who needs to jump in over here.
Lieutenant Colonel John Swigert, Army for 37 years, and we call it Land of the Free, Home of the Brave for that reason. This room is an American, no color, no creed, no background. So in order to save that or preserve that, that's why we have the Army, Air Force, Navy, all of those forces. Otherwise, all would be found. We don't mess around. I go to the Found Air Force Base all the time. Nobody's going to mess with us, period. If they do, all I can say is, suck it up, because we're all going down the tube. So yeah, no, I think what we just need to do is get each other, the brothers, sisters, America.
Yeah. I think that factors such as you've pointed out, Colonel, are the sorts of things that perhaps the Chinese planners might not be giving enough weight to.
Correct.
And I'm also, that this leads me to think about, it reminds me of Japanese thinking before Pearl Harbor too.
There you go.
And the assumption, well, we just land a strong blow, and the Americans will be upset for a little while, and then they'll agree to a peace that preserves the status quo and keeps us with most of our winnings.
Right.
No, we were really pissed.
Thank you.
Any other questions? One back here.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned chance, because I was thinking that, well, America and the other countries, they're thinking that they will win in their calculations. And so when you started talking about chance, then it made more sense to me that like Afghanistan, that didn't turn out very well. Sometimes it just doesn't. World War II, some of the battles didn't turn out well. So it's the calculations.
Yes. That's certainly the notion that chance plays a huge role, and that there are far too many variables involved. Written about their approach to war is this element of certitude. It's like, no, wait a minute. And I think, to me, history proves the opposite. I mean, including if you dig down into it, Chinese history, there are various kind of overconfident leaders again and again who've gotten their comeuppance.
I don't understand the strategy of China's war strategy, because she's 66 years old, and as Americans, I feel as though it doesn't matter what type of war they win or want to be in, they don't care. But what can I do as an American to protect me? I'm trying to war.
Yeah, that is bring it to the personal level like that. I can, yeah, I can certainly have some thoughts about what the U.S. government and other governments can do. And one of the most obvious ones for dealing with China, and one of the reasons that China has so long been envious of the United States is because we have so many high-class allies, and they refer to our allies as high-class allies. Like countries like Japan, Canada, most of the European countries, and Australia, New Zealand, it just goes on and on. And how many allies does China really have? And there are countries that align with China of convenience, but say like Russia, Iran, but how much do they really trust each other? How much can they really count on each other? And that's an open question. And they don't even talk about North Korea. For the Chinese consider North Korea to be a huge pain for them too, and Pakistan. So
I'll just keep praying, thank you.
yeah. So I think I think we should keep our allies close, and that's one of the so I suppose that's one way you can try practicing kind of personal diplomacy or something.
Thank you so much.
Would be that personally all of us can vote responsibly with good leaders, and that would be a
Yes, here.
I just wondered more about that ranking system that you talked about.
Yeah.
I mean, are countries ranked from best to worst, worst to best?
Yeah,
Like on a scale of 1
yeah.
to 10? Or?
I'm not sure what the scale is, but they are, every country receives a number, and the numbers are being recalculated at least on an annual basis.
You didn't know what ours is?
No. But unfortunately, I think it's lower than it used to be.
You're talking a good bit about having a high-class ally. I'm worried about, I don't think our allies are gonna be here. I'm watching what's going on in Australia, France, Great Britain, Canada. I wouldn't trust any of them now to cross the street with us. The way they're going in their country, they don't care. They've got too many migrants. And I may be wrong, but I just don't think I would trust them.
This is probably one of those areas that belongs to chance or uncertainty. But I think as long as one has even the kind of nominal relationship and a history of cooperation, is something that an adversary like China has to take into consideration. It will X, Y, or Z come to the aid of the United States, or won't they? So it's just one more thing they have to worry about. They have to try to find a way to work it into their calculations.
Does anyone else have any questions for Dr. Graff?
I don't need a microphone needed. Dr. Graff, with respect to the First Island chain and our utilization of that and our allies in the area to contain China, how effective do you think that has been and will continue to be going forward into the future, utilizing that chain of islands as a form of containment?
Yep, certainly that, and throughout the not is maybe more a political one than a military one. And it has to do with kind of questions of will, as the gentleman up here pointed out earlier, that United States, Japan, the Philippines, Taiwan, and maybe a few others stand together, I think the first island chain is fairly firm. And if there's any waffling or wavering anywhere, then you know, we have to start asking questions. But there's also the problem too, beyond that, the second island chain, which includes Guam. And of course, in this day and age, with missiles of all sorts, including hypersonic ones and so forth, that the second island chain is not entirely safe. And I think the Chinese have shown a lot of interest in targeting Guam in particular in the event of a future war. So it's more complicated than just the first island chain. And of course, the first island chain is not an absolute block on anything at the moment. So the Chinese occasionally send flotillas, naval flotillas, on little cruises up near Alaska, sometimes in concert with a few Russian vessels, just to show us they can do it. Do you have a follow-up question?
Well, it was just with respect to the question of chance in politics, considering the amount of disputes that are going on over the South China Sea in countries such as Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan, etc. Would you, and I know this dives into speculation, I apologize, but would you say that the chances of our allies and perhaps not so allies, but people that are on the fence, are more in our geopolitical favor over that, say, of China because of those disputes?
Yes. The short answer is yes. China isn't making any friends with their sharp elbows in the South China Sea. They're antagonizing everybody in the neighborhood, and including even their fellow communists in Vietnam. Probably as angry about the situation in the South China Sea as the Filipinos are.
This is kind of an aside. This is kind of an aside, but where do you place the blue launch in their tags? How do you see it?
I missed the key word there. How do I place?
The balloon launch.
Oh, the balloon launch. Okay. I think it does fit very well with the slow, patient, and stealthy, doing things under the radar. So, who would ever think that we might be doing this? And the guy got away with it for quite a while. So it's gaining advantage in various, quiet little ways that you're hoping the other guy's not going to notice. I would put that as a minor example, but a nice one.
You were just talking about the snow, how do you feel about the road and belt initiative
Yeah.
in Africa?
That again fits very well with kind of the kind of slow and stealthy, and also the positioning, as in the game of Go, Wei Chi. So invest in ports around much of the world, in strategic locations, sign deals with local governments, build up the port facilities, in some cases get management over port facilities, even ownership, and then there's the possibility of, say, dual use in the event of a conflict. So you could think of the Belt and Road as China's putting down stones, maybe not as part of a master plan, that okay, here's the first phase, the second phase, the third phase, and the fourth phase is we really show the Americans who's boss. I'm not sure it's that clear cut, but they're creating positions, kind of facts on the ground that may eventually, the event of a future conflict, make it much more difficult for us.
The Chinese still own 3 or 4 major ports over here. They bought into them, I know.
In the U.S., I'm not sure that
I
they
think there's a couple of major ports in California the Chinese own. Have a pretty good sized state.
Do we have any other questions for Dr. Graff before I wrap up? All right, thank you very much, Dr. I want to give him a round of applause. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with us here at the Museum of World Treasures. Thank you for driving down here to Wichita for this afternoon. And a reminder for everyone that next month's Senior Wednesday is September 4th. And before that, we also have Coffee with the Curator coming up here in August, on August 15th, when Gene Chavez will be giving a free talk sponsored by Humanities Kansas called Flower Power, about the history of the humble but delicious flower. So I hope to see you all there for that, and have a wonderful afternoon.